My name is Paul-Jervis Heath. I'm a designer and innovation consultant. Essentially, I use human-centered design to help businesses to invent their future. I lead design projects. I work with organizations to build their capability for design thinking. I've been a designer for about 16 years, so I've been around a little bit. And in that time, I've worked with a lot of clients to introduce human-centered design into their methodologies. I've led some really interesting design projects. So I've designed things like in-car information systems, smart home appliances, concepts for retail stores of the future, lots of different kind of services and digital products for lots of different sectors and for companies both big and small. I've won the odd design award along the way, but one of my current projects is one of the most interesting of my career, and it's probably the reason I'm in front of you today. About 18 months ago, I was asked by the University of Cambridge to help reinvent their academic libraries for the 21st century. Cambridge is a really interesting environment. So it's regularly ranked as one of the best research universities in the world. It can lay claim to about 90 Nobel laureates. It's a collegiate university, so students are taught in a mixture of colleges and faculties. Science research attracts much of its funding. And it's an interesting environment to reinvent academic libraries. So it was a hard kind of brief to resist when they invited me. And I think the thing that really attracted me is the amount of disruption happening in the library space. I mean, you all know better than I do about the challenges that are facing academic libraries, but they seem to fall between changing modes of teaching and the kind of perfect storm of academic publishing and the kind of open access draft, the HEFKI policy and changes to that provide this kind of feedback loop to encourage change within the academic space. And there's also VC funding, a lot of funding flooding into the area around education, around scholarly communications, that's bringing new services and new technology into the domain. So it's an exciting time for me to be involved in libraries and education and scholarly communications. And I think part of that is that we see people's expectations being led by the services that they use at home, by consumer technology. And we've heard that from Lynn. You know, their expectations are not being driven by what we've traditionally provided as universities. They're being led by what they use at home. So, you know, if we're going to attract and retain the best and brightest academics, then the university has to provide decent services. Services that actually help them spend time doing research. Services that actually help them to find what they're looking for, not things that they have to learn to use before they can start using them. So whether it's students or academics, you know, most of them have a smartphone. Most of them have some kind of computing device. They're used to Google services or Apple services. They use seamless technology like Dropbox or Evernote. You know, they shop online with Tesco's or John Lewis or Amazon. You know, so they're used to the idea that things work seamlessly. And that's, you know, what these experiences teach us. They reinforce this idea that technology and information should be seamless. You know, and then they arrive at the library and they get given library search. And we try and teach them how to use it. We go looking for teachable moments. How many times do Google look for teachable moments in the search experience? Right? And this is the problem. So what does intuitive mean? Well, intuitive means, can I use it without being taught how to use it? And I think that's one of the key definitions. And then technology is also providing new options for teaching and learning. We're seeing undergraduates arrive at university with being used to kind of increasing amounts of group work. We've seen, when we've watched students, we see students working alone but together. So they'll group together, they'll work on problems on their own, but then they'll pop up and go, what did you get for question 7? And they'll have a little discussion about it, and then they'll go back to working independently. Now, libraries aren't always kind of the perfect spaces for doing that kind of research, so, doing that kind of work, so they'll look for other spaces to use. And obviously, some teachers at secondary level are kind of experimenting with different models of teaching, things like the Khan Academy, and getting students to learn online, and then turning the traditional teaching model on its head, so that they do problems in class. and kind of work together to answer problems. And so I think what we'll see is students arriving with different skills and different expectations, and the next generation of lecturers and teachers are bound to use classroom time differently as well. And so, you know, the academic library is a natural home for learning materials and MOOCs and e-learning platforms and all of those kind of things, but it's also the natural home for the knowledge that goes around some of the kind of ways of teaching as well. Open access is changing how academic discourse happens and how kind of scholars communicate their theories and findings to their peers and to the world. So speakers from the UK yesterday talked about the recent changes to RCUK and HEFCE policy, so I'm not going to go into all of that again. But what that's creating, though, is if academics are going to publish into an institutional repository, it makes complete sense for the library to be the home of that institutional repository. It makes sense for academic libraries to provide services that support academics in categorizing their research, assigning metadata and all of those kind of things. And I don't want to have to spend a long time, as Lynn says, uploading my document. I can get it onto Dropbox automatically from my computer. And that's teaching me that this should be simple. I don't want to go through a 5-page form filling in metadata about my article. And then just think about how that changes the publishing industry, particularly the publishing of journals. The journals are middlemen. The internet is brilliant at disintermediating middlemen. You know, fellow academics provide much of the work that goes into journal publication. The internet cuts out all of that kind of middleman stuff. You know, we've seen it in the music industry. Academic publishing is in a very similar state, if you ask me, to where the music industry was 15 years ago. And the music industry today earns its money in a completely different way to how it did 15 years ago. Artists spend a lot more time doing concerts and gigs and stuff like that, and that's how they earn their money, whereas those used to be loss leaders to CD sales. And so we're going to see a change in business models, I think, in academic publishing. And so it's pretty exciting. I'm pretty pumped to be kind of working in the space, because I don't think we have to sit on the sidelines waiting to see how it works out. I think actually academic libraries have a really key role to play in driving some of these changes. And this is a great quote. To invent a future that doesn't exist, you really have to understand what people are doing today and completely reimagine it. So if you're going to understand what people are doing, then design research helps to do that. So what I'm doing is I'm applying design thinking, design techniques at Cambridge to the challenges that libraries face in order to invent new services, in order to adapt the library's position, move things forward. And I mentioned design thinking. So I think the most important thing about, or the first step in design thinking is design research. Innovation's driven by design research, not market research. So how do you find out what people actually need? Well, you don't ask them. Right? User-centered design isn't asking people what they want. It's understanding what they need. And the problem with market research is that it gives you opinions, but it doesn't show you behavior. It doesn't show you what they actually do. It doesn't tell you why they actually do it. And so focus groups and surveys are great, but they're market research. They tell you what people think. They don't tell you what people do, and so they're not so useful for design. You hear lots of opinions, but you don't always get genuine insight. Let me tell you a story. So, does anybody have one of these? Anybody recognize this? Right, so this is a Good Grips measuring jug. This, I think, was designed by a company called Smart Design out in California. And they watch a lot of people cook in order to invent new products. And so one day they get people in a test kitchen. They give them a set of ingredients, and they ask them to bake a cake. And 5 minutes into the session, this strange phenomena sweeps the room. Does anybody in here bake? Right. So those of you who bake know that the amount of liquid that you put in when you're baking is massively important. It's the difference between a totally sloppy mess and something that's inedible, right? So we're in a test kitchen. In 5 minutes, we've got this weird phenomena sweeping the room, right? And what that is people doing this. like some kind of crazy meerkats. They're up and down across the room, right? And of course, what people are doing, well, a scientist would say, they're eliminating parallax error in measuring their liquids, right? Now, it doesn't matter how many focus groups you do. Nobody in a focus group would ever say, I need to eliminate parallax error when I'm baking, right? Now, that's what you get from observing people. You see the things that they don't even think about. You know, we all do that. It's all natural. You know, it's a natural thing to do. But the design intervention for that is this jug here, and all they've done is they've placed the scale diagonally inside so that you can stand as a normal kind of human being and see straight in and see exactly how much liquid is in that jug from a standing position without having to do all that meerkat stuff, right? Now, that isn't going to change the world, but it's a really good example of how a single design insight, a single observation, leads to a single design intervention that makes things simple for people. And it shows the limitations of focus group-based research and the power of observational research. So this is Dscale. This is a little application that allows us to put a diary study on people's mobile phones. So what we can do with that is we can ask them to keep a diary about how they use information resources, how they study. What we did at Cambridge is we got a group of students. It's really easy to get students to kind of volunteer for studies because pizza, beer, offer them, you know, offer them kind of book tokens and things like that, and they're keen to help. And so we asked them to keep a diary over, I think it was 6 weeks in Michaelmas term, which is what we call the first term of the year between September and Christmas. Cambridge has funny names for all those things. And we asked them to keep a diary of all the things that they did to study during those 6 weeks. And every time they did something related to studying, they logged it. They took a photo using their mobile phone, and they asked 6 or 7 quick questions about what they were doing. And so we got to see this kind of pattern of behavior through very, very low interaction, you know, through very low cost to them. They could very quickly tell us what they were doing. And we got hundreds and hundreds of what Dscale calls snippets of these photos and answers to these questions. And so we got a really good glimpse into their behavior. And they didn't just tell us about studying, they told us about all the social things they were doing. They told us about how they were using Facebook to sub-borrow material from the library. They told us all about all kinds of things that were going on that we would never have known if we'd have got them all into a room and asked them how they go about studying. What we created from these, and from 2 other studies that we were doing, was we spoke to about 150 students across 5 sets of disciplines between that study, between some contextual interviews and depth interviews as well. And when you speak to people, you start noticing patterns. And what we do is we then take those patterns as designers and distill them into behavioral profiles. And so behavioral profiles are like archetypes of users. They look like people, but these profiles do not describe people. That's really important. What they describe is a set of needs, a set of motivations, a set of attitudes, a set of expectations. And so what we do then is we turn them into these profiles, and they look like a person because that helps us as designers imagine real people. It's hard to design for a set of kind of disjointed motivations and needs and behaviors, turn it into a person, and all of a sudden your brain fills in the gaps for you, and you can start to think about how these different people would use different things. And it's worth noting that they're not marketing personas. They don't describe mythical kind of average customers. What we try to do is try and draw out differences so that you actually get kind of extremes. And so there's David. David is at Cambridge really because he wants Cambridge to open doors for him. You know, he knows that a 2-1 from Cambridge will get him a job at a top law firm or a top accountancy firm or, you know, some kind of top company. But he's also, so he places a value on networking over just kind of pure academic study. And so being president of my JCR will help me get a job at a top firm from actually making contacts. He's stopped going to lectures because he knows supervisions are the way that he'll learn. They group together, him and his friends, and one of them goes to each lecture, and then they'll compare notes. We've seen it happening. They'll compare notes on Facebook, right? That's how they'll share them, and things like that. And then there's Matthias. So Matthias wants to do well at university, but also wants a good time. And so satisficing, yeah, he's totally satisficing because he wants to do all of the social things that go along with being at university, as well as, you know, getting a reasonable degree at the end of it. And then there were a set of people like Katrina who were totally kind of, they hadn't understood how the study game was played. And so when they got a list of 100 books as a reading list, they literally tried to read all of them. They don't know how David is being president of the JCR. They don't know how Matthias is down the student union twice a week, because Katrina doesn't have time. She doesn't physically have time to do all the things that she's been told to do. And she doesn't realize that she's not expected to do all of them, because that's the secret, right? But they all have certain things in common. So they all follow a 3-to-1 reading to writing ratio. You know, when asked to write an essay, they'll spend about 3 times longer reading than they will writing. Certain of their behaviors will be influenced by their discipline. Certain behaviors will come down to intrinsic or extrinsic motivations. And you probably know that one of the common patterns across all undergraduates and taught masters is that students prefer the control of studying in their room. You know, so given the choice, the place where they'll most want to study is their room. And so, yeah, Google, yeah, electronic resources, because they're on my computer. And I don't have to leave my room. And, you know, if you think about it, that's about convenience. I can sit with a cup of tea while I'm studying. I can eat a fish finger sandwich with ketchup while I'm studying. I can nip to the loo and not have to pack all my stuff in my bag and take my bag with me to take a toilet break and all of those kind of things. And so for human reasons, I prefer studying in my room. And the exception to that is when undergraduates and postgraduates hit the wall, when they find it really hard to maintain their momentum. And that's when they really value a library, because a library is a quiet space. It's where everyone else is feverishly working, and it focuses the mind, like a monk's cloister. Right? And so they use it as a way of kind of focusing them and feeling guilty when they're not studying hard enough and when they're checking Facebook because everybody around them is working really hard. Now, Cambridge, the university is kind of set in the city. It's really hard to separate the university from the city, and there's university buildings dotted all over the city. And the way students move around the city is really interesting. Their perception of geography is set by factors completely out of our control, as you'd imagine, because each student has a unique geographic triangle. And that triangle is made up of their college, where they live, their department, where their lectures happen, and the supermarket that they like to shop at. And so they form a geographic triangle. And anything that occurs outside of that geographic triangle seems inconvenient. And so they describe the physical distance as being further away when it falls outside that triangle, even when it actually isn't any further than some of the things they already go to. And the student triangle is interesting because it kind of demonstrates how personal distance is. And so there's a kind of way that you can categorize locations geographically, and so the university has kind of 3 major hubs. And if your college and your faculty are in the same hub, then life's a doozy. You know, you can roll out of bed 5 minutes before the lecture begins, and you can be at your, sat in a lecture as it starts. But also you have a choice of facilities open to you, because you can use your college library, you can use your department library, everything's within, short distances. If your college and your faculty are in different hubs, then you have more of a distance, and so your choices of environment are kind of cut down or restricted because of the travelling time, because most people walk or cycle in Cambridge. And so your experience of the university can be very different. The physical act of writing notes kind of augments memory. So I think there's good kind of evidence that actually writing things down helps. And so, but also we assume that students will be like up on technology. And that's generally a misconception. Most students will know exactly how to get their music onto their mobile phone, but they won't necessarily know how to get the notes that they've just taken on their device back onto their computer. You know, they won't be aware of things like Evernote or PairNote or concentration or, you know, these apps that, you know, we'll all kind of know and kind of think a standard issue for a student. They just won't have heard about them until one of their peers tells them about them or until they kind of happen across them. The author Neil Gaiman recounted a conversation that he'd had with Douglas Adams more than 20 years ago, in which Douglas Adams, the author of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, said that a real book was like a shark. Sharks are old. There were sharks in the ocean before the dinosaurs, and the reason there are still sharks around is that sharks are better at being sharks than anything else is. Physical books are tough. They're hard to destroy, they're bath resistant, they're solar operated, they feel good in your hand. They're good at being books, and there will always be a place for them. That's what Douglas Adams said. And I think it's true that students do prefer physical books, because if you think about how students study, they've got more than one book open at a time. Have you tried that with an e-book platform? Oh, man. You know, if you look at the design of e-book platforms, if Apple products are like a high point in product design, then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got e-book platforms. They're terrible. It's like people have never watched people study before they came up with these things. Because if you're studying, you've got books spread around you. You're looking across different things. You're cross-referencing as you go. You're not sitting at a computer is not the best way to read, first of all. You know, and so getting it on your tablet or something like that would be much better. So, and you know what? It doesn't cost any more to design these things properly than it does to design them badly. So I don't know why they're so awful. But what we do see is students using ebooks to augment the printed book. There are kind of two ways that they use them. The first one is the resource of last resort. All the copies of a book have gone. Oh, I might as well use the ebook. The other one is really interesting because what people will do is they'll set their computer back on the desk at kind of arm's length, and then they'll put the physical books in front of them. They'll search in the ebook like this, and then they'll flick to the physical book and read it in there. Then they'll move that aside, mark the page, search in the ebook, and read in the physical book, and move that aside. And then they'll bring them both in. And so you see these kind of behaviors with ebooks because the ebook platforms are just not cut out for kind of full studying yet. They augment the physical book. They don't replace it. This is an autographer camera. It's a little life logging camera. It automatically takes a picture every 10, 20, or 30 seconds. And we take it with us when we do shadowing. So shadowing is one alternative. Another alternative way that you can discover what people really need. Essentially, you follow them. Ideally, you ask them before you follow them, because people get really creeped out if you don't, right? But shadowing allows you to build empathy with your users, because you immerse yourself in their world. You see their activities, you see their thought processes, so it gives you a really rich seam of insight. And so about 6 months ago, we ran a shadowing study with Cambridge academics. We recruited 20 academics. We shadowed them for 2 days each, and they were great about just letting us sit in everything that they were doing. And that gave us a really deep insight into what it means to be a researching academic and have all of the teaching commitments that people have. So we really got to see what life as an academic was really all about. And I'm a designer, so I didn't know an awful lot about academics. I draw pictures for a living, so research academics was a world that I hadn't really explored. You know, so we got to see how many different tasks academics do in a day. We got to see what kind of the cost of context switching, constantly switching between different things. We got to understand their mental models. And Lynn asked about how you make something intuitive. Well, mental models are the thing, right? Because you have a picture in your head of how something works, of how the world works. And those things that are intuitive are the things that match your mental model. 5 minutes? Wow. And so we got to see their mental models. And we came up with a similar set of personas for academics. We got the academic who's setting out to change the world and change academic policy, to change government policy. We got the academic who's interested in being the expert, wants to be interviewed by Melvin Bragg on Radio 4, or sat next to Dara O'Brien on, on a science program or something like that. There's the academic who just loves the things. You know, they're really interested in old coins or stars in far-off galaxies or things like that. And then Christine on the end is interested in mentoring the next set of academics. Now, they sound like caricatures because I'm whizzing through them because I've only got a little bit of time left. But actually, again, it's that set of attitudes, motivations, behaviors that kind of make those up. They're not real people, they're behavioral profiles. And one of the academics said she wears lots of hats. I don't think she meant like this. These are the Peruvian hat sellers in Puno on the banks of Lake Titicaca. But what she meant is that academics have lots of different roles. The average academic has 6 or 8 or 10 different roles within the university. And the longer you're at the university, the more roles they give you, the harder they make it. And so we spoke to an academic who was reviewing papers in 10-minute slices. That's how efficient she got at it because of all the commitments on her time. And that's what these people are dealing with. So do they want to learn how to use a search system when they're trying to find a reference? No, they don't. Not unless it takes about 30 seconds. And it's difficult for academics to actively progress research during term time as well. Research groups were interesting because they have different dynamics depending on the research group. But most interesting was we started to look at academic disciplines. We started to look at how they were related. Because one of the models that people have in their heads about the difference between academic disciplines is that it's the sciences, or arts, humanities, and social sciences. And there was differences between them. Well, actually what we found was that the things that make a difference between academic disciplines are whether the discipline is solo or collaborative. The medium of discourse, because in some disciplines, the medium of discourse is the monograph. Now, whereas in others it's journal articles. Now, if it's journal articles, you're kind of hunky-dory because hefty value journal articles, whereas the monograph, you could spend 5 years writing a monograph and it's still only worth the same as a journal article in the last research excellence framework. And so we see this behaviour where academics, where their unit of discourse was the monograph, publishing extra journal articles because of needing credit for the research excellence framework. The necessity of external funding, which of course is related to whether the discipline is solo or collaborative, and the source of that funding is interesting as well. Like a lot of sciences have a lot of external funding from research councils and things like that. And pace as well. You know, the pace of the discipline affects how people behave. And the tendency towards transparency. So in some disciplines, you keep what you're working on a secret until you're ready to publish and tell everyone about it. In other disciplines, you publish early because you need to mark your territory. And by publishing early, everyone respects what you're working on and nobody kind of steps on your toes. And so you see different ways of kind of behaving there. And so what we've come up with from the research that we've done is kind of 6 strategic themes. The transition from physical to digital is important. It changes a lot about the libraries. It has a knock-on effect into the physical spaces. But what do people, if the library isn't about books, what does the physical space become? What do academics actually need of the physical space at Cambridge? So we're looking at all of those things. We're looking at how we make classic library services more sustainable, about how we can use some of the digital stuff, how we can use that to augment what people are doing, how we can use it to improve what people are doing, how we can use it to focus classic library services as well. We're looking at how the library supports research and scholarly communications. We're looking at how the internet could make special collections more available, because we've put a load of stuff online, and it's pretty cool that you can kind of see Newton's notebooks and zoom into them and kind of see and Darwin's correspondence and things like that. You know, there's some cool stuff at Cambridge. But how do we make it more available, and who do we make it to? And then finally, and this is a theme that's come up, I've noticed over the last few days, service discovery is the one gap that seems to be present in the libraries. Lynn said that people don't necessarily, or kind of hinted at the fact that people don't necessarily know what libraries do other than give them books. Well, that's because we don't do service discovery very well. We're actually terrible at helping people discover our services. How do we lead a user from one touch point, whether it's a physical touch point or a digital touch point, to the next? You know, if you think about, if you're shopping online, you know, you'll shop online and then you have a choice. You can either go into store and pick up what you've bought, or you can get it delivered to your house, right? So we lead, in retail, they lead you through the touch points. They bring you back. They have ways of bringing you back onto their site. Libraries, as far as I see, have not been very good at doing that kind of thing. And so what we're doing is we're mapping touch points. We're trying to understand how people move between touch points. We're trying to make those touch points seamless, because it's not just technology that needs to be seamless. It's actually the whole experience. It's the transition from offline to online, from online to offline, from the transition between touch points that live on digital. And you can do that through service design, through touch point mapping, through service blueprinting, and that's some of the things that we'll be coming on to doing at Cambridge over the coming months. So I'll leave you with that as a thought, I think. Thank you very much.